The ravens had stopped coming weeks ago. Olenna Tyrell stood alone in the heart of Highgarden's silent court, her fingers tracing the rim of a wine goblet that had long run dry. The once vibrant corridors of the Reach's jewel were now a mausoleum of whispers and dread. The laughter, the music, the perfume of blooming roses gone, replaced by silence, and a creeping cold that came not from the north, but from within. She had always known Lannisters could not be trusted. They had taken her granddaughter, her legacy, and burned it to ash in the name of power. The Iron Throne had become a furnace, consuming every noble house that dared reach for it. Olenna was no fool. She would not let her house be next. But she had never expected salvation to arrive from the grave. It started with frost on the petals. In the peak of summer, roses began to wither. The garden's breath, once sweet and warm, turned sharp and icy. Her mesters could not explain it. They babbled of weather anomalies, dark omens, strange winds. But she had seen stranger things in her time. Dragons reborn, a bastard king returned from death, wildfire consuming seps of innocence. So when the emissary came half-frozen, skin blue like moonlight, and eyes like shattered glass, Olenna did not scream. She listened. The thing had not spoken in words. It didn't need to. Its presence filled her with images. Snow falling on King's Landing, the red keep collapsing under white storms, Circe clawing at the gates as her people froze and shattered. The White Walkers were coming, not just to kill but to erase. But then she saw something else. An offer. A vision of Highgarden untouched by war, of Tyrell banners flying high above a sea of ice, of her bloodline preserved, of her enemies, the Lannisters, the Targaryens, even the Baratheons crushed beneath an army that did not sleep, did not bleed, and would not betray. And she saw herself, standing beside the Night King, untouched by age or time, a flower, made eternal by winter. "You want the realm," she had whispered that night, sitting alone with her candlelight and memories. "Take it, but leave me my garden." A pact was struck in silence. No raven flew. No seal was stamped. Only the frost deepened, and the first of her soldiers began to die with smiles on their faces and return with blue eyes and quiet loyalty. Margaery was gone, buried with faith and fire. Laura's had been broken by the sparrows. The Reach had no heirs worth saving. So Olenna, ever the thorn beneath the bloom, turned her cunning not toward alliances, but survival. And in that calculation, humanity was the price. The first to notice was Randyll Tarly. He had ridden to Highgarden demanding answers for the cold, the disappearances, the strange silence in the towns around the castle. Olenna met him in the same hall she'd once entertained kings. "You serve a dying realm," she said coldly, her eyes harder than steel. "I serve what comes after." He spat at her feet. He died before the moon rose. His men joined the night. From there, things moved quickly. Villages emptied. Farmers vanished. The earth, once fertile and gold with wheat, turned pale and cracked. Beneath a creeping frost, birds flew south and never returned. And yet, Highgarden stood untouched, its towers still proud, its banners still waving, even as the world beyond was swallowed in ice. In the north, Jon Snow rallied men of honor and desperation. In the east, Daenerys burned cities in her march. West, but in the heart of the Reach, Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, smiled and sipped her wine, surrounded by white roses that never wilted. They all played the game of thrones, she muttered to herself, as she watched the frost crawl slowly across the map of Westeros. But only I understood the rules were changing. Outside the castle, a fresh bloom of ice roses spread across the soil, each petal crystalline, each root deep with death. And in the dark horizon beyond, the dead marched not just with vengeance, But with banners of green and gold dot the night, after Randall Tarley's death, Highgarden became quieter than usual. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, but the kind that weighs on your chest like a stone. Servants no longer whispered in corners. Most of them had already fled, taken by the cold or something worse. Those who stayed moved like shadows, their eyes dim, their mouths stitched by fear or loyalty. No one questioned Olenna anymore. She stood in her solar that night, staring at a map of Westeros. The candles flickered even though there was no wind. Her fingers hovered over the riverlands then. King's Landing, then up north toward Winterfell. They think the north is where death marshes, she whispered. Fools, death grows in the soil too, especially when it's watered with betrayal. In the dungeons below, something stirred. That's where she kept the first of her gifts. From the Night King former men of the Reach, soldiers, lords, even a mester or two. When they rose, they didn't scream or fight or question. They obeyed. They remembered enough of who they were to wear a sigil or carry a sword, but their hearts no longer beat. Olenna looked into their lifeless eyes and felt nothing. What disturbed her wasn't their silence. It was how useful they were. No complaints, no politics, no ambitions, just loyalty to her. And him. She had tried once to speak with the Night King again, to summon him. But he was not a man to parley. He didn't need words. His reply came in cold winds and fresh bodies delivered to her walls, like offerings. She had no doubt that when the time came, he would arrive. And when he did, she would be ready. That same night, a raven did arrive, the first in weeks. Not from the north, not from the wall, but from King's Landing. Cersei. Olenna read the message 3 times, each time slower than the last. It was short, direct, and dripping with that familiar arrogance. The realm shivers, but not from cold. You think yourself clever, old rose, but you forget what fire does to frost. Bend the knee, or burn with the weeds. She chuckled, but there was no joy in it. Still so sure the world revolves around your throne, she said. Still playing with wildfire when winter's fingers are already around your throat. She wrote no reply. She didn't need to. Instead, she summoned her. Generals, the ones who still breathed. Some were uneasy. They had seen their brothers return from death, had felt the temperature drop when Olenna entered the room, had begun to understand that their lady was no longer serving the gods of the south or the gods of men. But they dared not speak. Cersei? Plans to strike, Olenna announced. She thinks wildfire can stop what's coming. She doesn't understand that winter isn't a season, it's a choice. Lord Mathis Rowan, the youngest among them, and perhaps the last with a flicker of fear in his eyes, dared to ask, "And what do we choose, my lady?" She looked him dead in the face. "We choose survival, at any cost." That night, her forces began to move not toward the north, like the rest of Westeros, but east through the Reach toward the heart of the Riverlands. Villages were left behind, cold and empty. Castles were quietly abandoned. Those who resisted were offered the choice: serve in death or die in vain. And still, Highgarden remained untouched. Far across the continent, Daenerys Targaryen finally received word that something was wrong in the Reach. Her advisors, wary of every shadow, dismissed it as exaggeration until her dragons refused to fly over certain territories. Until ravens flew back frostbitten. Until Tyrion heard whispers that flowers had turned to ice. Jon Snow heard too, from scouts, from wildlings, from silence. "The south grows colder than the north," he said one night, brooding by firelight. "That's not natural. That's something worse." And worse was coming. Because while the living prepared for a fight in the snowy mountains, death had already made its bed in golden gardens. And the Queen of Thorns was planting a new kingdom, one that would never die. The riverlands burned, not with fire, but with frost. Villages once loyal to the Tullys and scattered remnants of Baratheon vassals stood no chance. They watched as men in Tyrell Green and gold arrived at their gates with perfect discipline. And dead eyes. There were no horns, no battles, no words. Only silence and cold breath as steel met flesh. These were not raids for plunder. These were methodical purges. Every soul not willing to swear to House Tyrell's new order vanished. Those who resisted were found days later, walking among their killers' faces pale, lips cracked, eyes glowing that same terrible blue. It wasn't a war. It was an infection. Olenna didn't travel with her army. She didn't need to. Her presence moved like legend, spreading faster than the frost itself. The people began to whisper her name, not as a noble matriarch, but as a witch. The Queen of Thorns had become something else, something cold, unkillable, and inhuman. In King's Landing, Cersei raged. Her spies brought back scraps of truth, too unbelievable to accept. The Tyrells have gone mad, she spat at Qyburn. They serve corpses now, puppets of the North. This isn't strategy, it's madness. But Qyburn, always too calm, disagreed. Madness, Your Grace, he said slowly, is sometimes just another form of foresight. Still, she prepared. Wildfire was moved from the crypts beneath the Red Keep to the outer districts. The gold cloaks were doubled. Ravens were sent, some even to Daenerys. Cersei was willing to speak with the Dragon Queen now. That alone said enough about her fear, but none of it reached Olenna. She sat in her gardens, where roses refused to die even in frost. Their colors remained, but the petals were cold to the touch like silk over a tombstone. Beside her, Sir Vailin, a former knight who had sworn himself in life, and now served more loyally in death, stood motionless, a constant reminder of what loyalty beyond the grave looked like. When a scout arrived with news of Jon Snow's war, council marching south, she smiled faintly. They'll come thinking they're fighting the dead, she mused aloud, but they'll find the living chose death long ago. She wasn't wrong. In Winterfell, Jon's table was surrounded by firelight and fear. He looked across faces hardened by war torment, Davos, Arya, Brienne, even Daenerys, who stood with arms folded, watching the flame as if it might flicker out with one wrong breath. What kind of madness is this? Brienne finally asked. Olenna Tyrell was no fool. Why would she bend the knee to the Night King? She didn't, Arya said quietly. She bent the world to her will instead, even death. Jon stood slowly. We can't fight both them and the Night King. We won't have to, Daenerys interrupted. Her voice was cold, now older, harder. We kill the root, Olenna. The frost may spread, but she's the one who planted it. Cut the rose from the stem. Jon looked at her for a long moment. And what happens when killing her means killing everyone she's already taken? Daenerys didn't blink. Then, we burn the garden. They rode out the next morning, a small band of trusted fighters. No armies. Armies were too slow, too obvious. They would meet at the Riverlands border, find what was left of the Tyrell host, and decide if this realm was still worth saving. But they were too late. When they reached the town of Fairmarket, they found it empty, not destroyed, not abandoned, just empty. Horses stood without riders. Food still steamed on plates. Doors hung open like mouths caught mid-scream. And carved into the ground outside the village square, burned deep into frozen soil, was a single sigil. A golden rose encased in a ring of ice. She's mocking us, Arya said, voice tight. No, Jon whispered. She's warning us. She's already won here. That night, as the group camped by what remained of a frozen river, Daenerys. stood alone staring at the stars. One of her dragons circled above, uneasy. She could feel it in her bones. They were walking into something far worse than undead soldiers. They were walking into a war of choices. A war where even victory could cost them their souls. And somewhere, far off in Highgarden, Olenna watched from her frosted balcony, wine in hand. "They'll come for me," she whispered to the dead flowers, blooming around her feet. "Let them. They'll find I've already buried them in a garden that never dies." Dawn never came. At least, not the kind they remembered. The sun that rose over the riverlands that morning was veiled in an ashen sky, dull and cold, casting a pale, colorless light over the frost-bitten fields. Jon Snow stood at the edge of what had once been a thriving village, a place filled with farmers, children, and simple folk. Now it was hollowed out, like a carcass gnawed on by something ancient and hungry. No blood, no bodies. Just cold. Nothing screams, nothing cries. Tormund muttered beside him, his usually brash voice. Quieter now. Even the wind feels wrong. Arya crouched in the center of the road, fingertips brushing over a patch of cracked ground. Beneath the frost, she found a child's toy wooden, carved roughly into the shape of a lion, burned at the edges, half melted, still warm. "They were taken recently," she said. "Not more than a day." Jon looked to the horizon. Somewhere, not far, was the army Olenna had built. But this wasn't an army of mindless wights. It was worse. These were men and women who had chosen death. People who remembered how to march, how to fight, how to lie. And they served the Queen of Thorns with a kind of devotion only the dead could manage. He turned to Daenerys, who stood silently near her dragon, Rhaegal. Her silver hair was tangled in the wind, but her eyes burned like wildfire. "We attack at night," she said, without waiting for his approval. "She expects us to hesitate. We hit her flank while she moves her lines. Take her by surprise. Cut the head off." Jon didn't respond right away. His heart told him to argue. His instincts told him this wasn't just another battle. This was something deeper, darker. But there was no time left for caution. "We move when the stars rise," he agreed. That night, they struck. It began in silence. Arya slipped through the enemy's camp like a ghost, her blade drawn, her breath tight. She knew what to expect: dead eyes, cold hands, the strange smell of earth and ice. But it wasn't the dead who disturbed her most. It was the living. A woman with a Tyrell sigil approached her in the dark. Her skin was flushed, warm, breathing. But her eyes, those lifeless blue eyes, met Arya's without fear. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, almost kindly. "The garden isn't ready for you." Arya didn't hesitate. Her blade slid across the woman's throat. But instead of blood, frost poured out. Elsewhere, Jon and Tormund clashed. With the front line, the Tyrell soldiers fought like knights, disciplined, sharp, precise. But there was no shouting, no rage, no war cries, just cold efficiency. One by one, Jon cut them down. And still more came, from the trees, from beneath the snow, from the earth itself. Daenerys flew overhead, Rhaegal blasting waves of fire across the battlefield. For a moment, the cold cracked and warmth returned, but only briefly. As soon as the flames died down, the frost returned, stronger than before. "She's using them like roots," Davos shouted as he swung his sword beside Brienne. "This isn't a battlefield, it's a garden. She's planted them into the land itself." And it was true. Every man who fell to the Tyrell blades didn't bleed out. They froze. And then they stood again wearing Jon's sigil, Daenerys's. Even the stark direwolf. Their memories faded, but their bodies returned to fight for Olenna. Jon realized too late what was happening. Olenna wasn't raising the dead like the Night King had. She was harvesting the living, and every soul lost in battle made her stronger. "We can't win this way," Jon shouted. "We're feeding." "Her!" Daenerys circled lower, Rhaegal screaming beneath her. She met Jon's eyes mid-flight and nodded grimly. The plan had changed. They needed to burn the garden at its root. By dawn, the survivors were scattered. Arya had vanished in the chaos. Tormund was wounded, and Brienne barely stood. Jon and Daenerys fled into the woods, frost curling at their heels. Behind them, the battlefield they had chosen to fight on had become something else. A field of glass, every blade of grass frozen, every tree crystallized, and in the center of it all, a single golden rose blooming through the snow. The journey to High Garden was not marked by roads or maps. It was marked by silence. Jon and Daenerys moved through what used to be the beating heart of the Reach. These lands had once sung with birds, overflowed with wheat, and smelled sweet. From apple orchards. Now they lay frozen under sheets of thin, cracking ice. The sun sat like a dim coin behind gray skies, offering no warmth, no guidance. They were down to only a handful now, Davos, Brienne, and the last few unsullied, who had survived the failed assault. Tormund had fallen behind, lost in the chaos. Arya hadn't been seen since she vanished into the dark of that cursed battlefield. But the worst part wasn't who was gone. It was who was watching. "Don't look back," Daenerys said quietly, as they moved through a small, frost-covered village. "They don't follow with noise. They follow with memory." Jon glanced at her. "You've seen them?" She nodded. "At night. I hear them whispering. Faces I knew Missandei, Jorah, even Grey Worm. But their voices, they're wrong. Like echoes inside a cave. Like something trying to remember how to be human." Jon didn't respond. He couldn't, because he'd heard them too. Sometimes he thought he saw Samwell's shape in the shadows, or ghosts, or Robb Stark's laugh in the wind. But they were never real, just shadows, memories. Or worse, by the time they reached the hills leading to High Garden, they no longer knew what season it was. The land had been altered entirely. Winter hadn't just come south, it had taken root. And in the distance, High Garden stood, not golden and green, but pale and gleaming like a castle made of glass. Ice crawled up the towers like ivy. The once lush fields around it were covered in crystalline petals, roses frozen mid-bloom. "Gods," Davos muttered. "It looks like a tomb." "It is," Brienne said, stepping forward, sword drawn. "And she's still sitting on the throne inside." Jon felt it too. A pressure in the air. Not like the Night King's chilling silence, but something more. Personal. Older. As if the very land whispered Olenna's name with reverence and fear. They crossed the final hill. No guards. No army. Just an open gate. As if she had been expecting them all along. Inside, the halls were exactly as Jon remembered them from his youth, except cold. No fires, no servants, no warmth. Paintings of summer hunts and family feasts were covered in frost, their colors faded. Statues were cracked. Chandeliers hung with icicles. And in the great hall, at the far end, beneath a massive arch of dead, vines, Olenna Tyrell sat alive. Not frozen, not changed. Just her. She wore a thick cloak of green and silver. Her face was older now, gaunt but still sharp. And her eyes, her human eyes, met Jon and Daenerys, as if she were simply receiving guests. "Took you long enough," she said, her voice dry as ever. Jon stepped forward slowly. "We know what you've done." "Do you?" she said with a faint smile. "You know of death, of war, but not of survival. Not like this." Daenerys raised her hand. Rhaegal landed just outside the keep, sending a wave of heat through the broken windows. But Olenna didn't even flinch. "You traded humanity for power," Daenerys said. "You poisoned the land, the people, the realm." Olenna leaned forward in her chair. "I preserved my house, my legacy, while the rest of you fought your petty wars and crowned your bastards and burned cities. You call it poison, I call it pruning. You're serving the Night King," Jon growled. "No," she said. "I used him, like I've used every fool who ever sat on that iron throne. He gave me what I needed: time, control, eternity. He thought he could claim the world. I claimed it first." The silence that followed was heavy. And then Olenna rose. Around the hall, the ice cracked from the shadows. Shapes emerged, familiar shapes. Grey Worm, Arya, Tormund, all pale, all still, all watching. Daenerys took a step back, her face breaking. But Arya didn't move. "She came for your war," Olenna said softly. "But she found a purpose here. She understood what I was offering. Peace, real peace. No hunger, no grief, no betrayal." Jon reached for his sword, but Olenna shook her head. "You kill me, Vegardin dies. But everything in it dies with me, including her." He looked at Arya. She blinked once. No emotion, no warmth. Just that terrifying stillness. Daenerys' voice cracked. "You don't get to make that choice. I already did." Then she stepped down the dais. The ice around the hall began to glow. Every rose, every wall, every frozen soul. Highgarden was no longer just a castle. It was a heart, a pulsing center of death's new order. And Jon knew, in that moment, they only had two choices: kill the Queen of Thorns and lose everything inside, or leave and let the frost take the realm. Jon Snow had always believed that every war had a one final boundary, between honor and damnation. He stared into Arya's eyes, searching for the sister he knew, the one who had laughed in the snow at Winterfell, the one who carried Needle like it was her soul. But the figure in front of him wasn't Arya anymore. She looked like her. She even breathed like her. But the warmth, the spark, that stubborn, furious heartbeat was gone. "Is she dead?" he whispered, more to himself than to anyone else. Olenna stepped softly across the frost-laced floor, her cane tapping gently. "She's preserved," she answered, "like a rose in a book. Untouched, undying, free from the pain this world never stops handing out." Daenerys trembled, her fingers flexing with fury. Rhaegal growled outside, steam rising from his nostrils. "You turned her into a monument." "I spared her from grief," Olenna said, still so calm. "From heartbreak, from fire and betrayal, and death by 1,000 broken promises. I gave her a place in eternity. You should be grateful." Jon's knuckles whitened around the hilt of Longclaw. "You speak of mercy like a butcher," he said. "And you," Olenna said sharply, "still think your sword can solve what time has already decided." Behind her, the dead moved in silent unison. Tormund stood beside Arya now. His face was marked by scars, but none fresh. He'd died quickly, perhaps painlessly. But like Arya, he held no anger, just that blank devotion to her, to the garden. Jon stepped back slowly. He wasn't afraid of dying. He had done it once already. What froze his blood was knowing that if he died here, he might wake up again, standing next to them. As something else. Daenerys' breathing quickened. "If you won't stop this, I will." Olenna turned to her with something resembling pity. "And how many more will you burn this time?" "You? Think dragonfire scares the dead? It warms the soil. It makes the garden grow." Daenerys raised her hand, and Rhaegal shrieked from outside the keep. Jon grabbed her wrist. "Wait," he said. She turned on him, fire flashing in her violet eyes. You want to wait? Look at them, John. That's Arya. That's Tormund. That could have been me. It still could be you. I know, he said. But killing Olenna now might not stop this. You saw what happened at Fairmarket. Even after she left, the frost stayed. You're saying this thing's bigger than her? Davos asked, his voice hoarse and low. John nodded. I think Olenna isn't the root anymore. I think she fed it, but now it's feeding her. Brienne's sword scraped as she stepped forward. Then what do? We can't fight her army. We can't leave Arya here. We can't win. And for the first time since they entered High Garden, Olenna smiled wide. You understand now, she said, her voice filled with cold triumph. The truth I learned long ago. The game you all played, it never mattered. The thrones, the dragons, the banners, they were just decorations on a dying world. Daenerys stared at her. Then what do you want, old woman? To sit on a frozen pile of bones while the world dies around you? No, Olenna said, stepping back to her throne. I want to outlive the gods. Silence dotted hit them like a sudden wind. Because in that moment, Jon realized what she had done. This wasn't about revenge. Not anymore. This was her final legacy. She had found a way to defy the one thing no noble house had ever conquered. Not war, not betrayal, not dragons, but death itself. Jon moved first. Slowly, carefully, his hand leaving Longclaw. We can't kill her, he said to Daenerys, his voice flat. Not here. Not without dooming Arya and the others. The garden will collapse, just like she said. Daenerys turned to him, confused. So what do? We starve it, he replied. He turned to Olenna now, stepping closer to the dais. This garden of yours. It needs soil, warmth, life. You want eternity, but you're still tied to the land. We take that away. And how do you plan to do that, boy? Olenna asked, raising an eyebrow. Jon looked over his shoulder at Daenerys. We burn the Reach, not just the fields, the rivers, the granaries, the cities, everything that feeds her. We cut the root from beneath, not above. Daenerys' face hardened. Her heart knew he was right, but her soul recoiled. That means killing innocents. They're already dead, Davos said quietly. They just don't know it yet. Olenna didn't move, didn't protest. She simply nodded, as if he had finally understood her. It's a shame, she said, you had to be reborn to see the world clearly. Imagine if you had ruled from the start. Jon didn't reply. He turned and walked out of the hall, each step feeling heavier than the last. Behind him, the others followed. Even Daenerys stopped as they passed through the empty halls of Highgarden. Jon felt it again, that terrible stillness. But now he understood what it was. Not death. Surrender. And he knew that to defeat Olenna Tyrell, the Queen of Thorns, they would have to commit a sin so great. It might not just kill the realm. It might kill the last of their humanity. The Reach burned, not in a single night, and not from war. It burned slowly, deliberately by design, not desperation. Jon Snow and Daenerys Targaryen did what they once swore they never would. They turned one of the most fertile, innocent regions of Westeros into scorched, barren earth. It began with the wheat fields. Villages like Cornfield and Hornhill were the first. Granaries were emptied, then put to flame. Rhaegal flew low over the countryside, releasing bursts of fire that didn't just destroy structures. They destroyed legacy. Crops turned to ash. Rivers once used for irrigation were blocked and poisoned with ash and rubble. Livestock were slaughtered or driven into the hills. Daenerys gave no speeches. Jon gave no orders aloud. The soldiers who remained few as they were understood the message. The war was no longer against men or monsters. It was against the very thing Olenna Tyrell had become. The frost receded at first dot, where fire fell. Her influence thinned. The air warmed. Birds returned. But so did the stench of what had been sacrificed to make that happen. And then came the people. Refugees poured from the forests and minor keeps, faces sunken, eyes dead. They weren't the dead, not yet, but they were marked, touched by Olenna's garden. Some walked with frost-bitten feet despite warm weather. Some spoke in riddles. Some simply stared, unmoving, until they dropped in silence. That it was Brienne, who first voiced what no one else dared to admit. "They're not people anymore," she said, wiping her blade clean after putting down a boy no older than 10 who had torn out a man's throat with his teeth. "They're seeds, planted, waiting to bloom." John closed his eyes. He had no arguments left. The fire had to keep spreading. Davos handled logistics, moving what few allies remained, setting up campfires, not for warmth, but to create dead zones, areas Olenna's influence could not reach. The old smuggler aged 10 years in a month. His voice grew hoarse. His hands shook. He stopped writing letters. There was no one left to send them to. Daenerys, meanwhile, kept to the skies. She didn't eat. She rarely slept. She flew regal over towns and castles she'd once dreamed of ruling, not to be queen, but to erase them from the board. Ashes could not be ruled. And that was the point, Dot. And John watched her. Every time she landed, her hair tangled with soot, her lips chapped from wind and fire. She looked more like a ghost than a queen, but he still loved her. Maybe because she reminded him of everything they were about to lose. One night, weeks into the campaign, they stood over the ruins of Golden Grove. It had once been a peaceful, quiet town, a place of song and cider and soft winds. Now it was a graveyard of glowing embers and blackened roots. "They'll hate us for this," Daenerys whispered. John nodded. "They already do." She turned to him. "Do you hate me for it?" He looked into her eyes, those tired, haunted eyes, and shook his head. "I hate what we had to become." That night, they made love for the first time since the Reach began to burn. Not for pleasure, not even for comfort. Just to remember they were still human. But Highgarden remained, despite everything they had done. Olenna's seat of power pulsed with cold life. Scouts reported the garden hadn't weakened. If anything, it had grown darker. Black roses bloomed now, flowers no one had ever seen before, made not of petals, but of something hard, glass-like, sharp. They didn't wilt. They cut skin, and still, Arya hadn't returned. Every night, John dreamed of her. In one vision, she stood at the center of the garden, a crown of thorns around her head, calling to him in a voice that wasn't hers. In another, she plunged her dagger into Olenna's chest, only to turn and smile with blue eyes. They didn't know what held her there. Hope? Control? Or had she become a root in the garden too? John couldn't decide. Then came the final omen. A raven. Blackened, frozen mid-flight. It dropped from the sky above the camp and shattered on impact like glass. Wrapped in its curled, dead claw was a single rose. Gold. Alive. Unfrozen. Daenery. Picked it up with gloved hands, staring in silence. "She's calling us home," she said. John stepped closer. "It's time." Davos looked between them. "You're going back?" "We never left," John said, because to kill Olenna Tyrell wasn't just to end the frost. It was to walk into death itself and ask it to let go. Asterisk. Highgarden awaited them like a tomb with its doors wide open. Jon Snow, Daenerys Targaryen, Brienne of Tarth, and Davos Seaworth stood before the frost-crowned castle, its once living walls pulsing with silent decay. Not a single guard stood watch. The air itself seemed to breathe cold beneath their feet. Rhaegal circled high above, wary now, nervous, as if even a dragon could feel the weight of what lay beyond those gates. No one spoke. This wasn't war. This was execution, one way or the other. They stepped inside. The path through the inner courtyard was overgrown with black crystal roses. Their stems curled around broken statues and old fountains, weaving a twisted beauty into the bones of the once beautiful stronghold. Flowers bloomed from cracks in the stone like veins in the skin of a corpse. They passed a frozen tree that still bore fruit apples turned pale blue, hard as stone, oozing a cold mist instead of juice. Jon didn't look at the walls. They were watching not with eyes, but with memory. The walls remembered every death that had happened inside. Every man who had knelt, every girl who had screamed, every sword that had struck. The echoes of those memories pulsed through the air like a heartbeat. She was close. Reached the inner sanctum, the same hall they'd entered once before, but this time it had changed. At the center stood Arya Stark, alive. She wore a long black cloak laced with roses. Her hair was loose, her skin pale, but her eyes were dark again, truly hers. Not blue, not dead, alive, but there was something wrong with her posture. She didn't look at them. She stood beside the throne, and upon it sat Olenna Tyrell, still, alive, still human, still waiting. "You burned my kingdom," Olenna said softly, her voice calm, almost proud. "You salted the soil. You killed the land. Well done." Daenerys stepped forward, her voice hard. "It ends now." "Yes," Olenna nodded. "It does." She rose to her feet, slowly but steadily. No cane, no shaking. The frost thickened. Beneath her steps like breath, curling from her heels. "I wanted to be remembered," she said. "Not as a queen, not as a lady. As a woman who refused to be swallowed by the world's noise. So I chose silence. I chose stillness." "You chose death," Jon said. "No," she snapped, eyes flashing with fury. "I chose continuity. Life is messy, loud, cruel. Death is clean, controlled, perfect. That's why they follow me." She gestured to the shadows behind her, and they came, not whites, not rotting corpses. People. Arya, Gendry, Samwell, Grey Worm, Missandei, even Sansa. Their forms, some were illusions. Some weren't. The hall was filled with them. Every memory Jon held dear turned into a mockery. They didn't speak. They just watched, judged. Olenna walked past them. "To destroy the garden," she said, "you must kill its heart." She opened her arms. "I am ready." Daenerys raised her hand, but Jon caught her wrist. "Wait," he said. "This isn't about her anymore. It never was." He looked at Arya. She was still staring down, silent. "Arya," he said gently. "You're still in there. I know you are." She blinked. And then finally she spoke. "She's not the root," Arya said, her voice shaking. "I am." The words struck like thunder. "She made me the anchor," Arya whispered. "She knew one of you would never leave me behind. But you'd come back. She planted me here, in the heart of her garden. That's how it spreads. Not from her, through me." Olenna said nothing. She just smiled. Jon staggered back. "No, I didn't know," Arya said, crying now. "I didn't know until you came." Jon's hand went to Longclaw. "But it shook. Could he do it? Could he kill her?" Daenerys stepped forward, voice steady, eyes burning. "You told me once," she said to Arya, "that you weren't afraid to." "Die," Arya nodded. "I'm still not." Jon looked into her eyes, and this time he saw her, his sister, the real one. With a deep breath, he raised Longclaw. Arya stepped forward, pulled back her hair, and whispered, "Do it before the garden blooms again." He drove the blade through her heart. Time stopped. The hall shook. The black roses withered. In a blink, frost cracked and shattered across the marble floors. The illusions screamed, some as memories, some as trapped souls. Olenna fell to her knees, gasping, her skin shriveling, her eyes turning to dust, and Arya smiled. "Thank you," she said, and she was gone. Only ashes remained. Olenna's body slumped on the floor, bones brittle, her face locked in frozen defeat. The garden was dead, for real. This time, outside, Rhaegal screamed into the sky as the frost finally lifted. Birds returned, trees bloomed. The air turned warm again, not with fire, but with life. Jon dropped to his knees. Daenerys knelt beside him, taking his hand, silent. There was no victory, only sacrifice. Arya was gone. The Reach was ashes. Highgarden was hollow, but Westeros was safe, and sometimes that had to be enough.